What if I told you the King of England is legally forbidden from speaking to his own son? In a revelation that has left royal watchers stunned, Princess and has confirmed the heartbreaking truth. King Charles is intentionally ignoring Prince Harry's phone calls, not out of spite, but because of a growing legal storm that threatens to drag the monarchy into the courtroom. Since stepping back from royal duties, Harry has tried to stay connected with his father, but now, even the most innocent conversation could be turned into evidence. Why is the king being advised to go silent? And how deep does this family fracture really go? Stay with us, because what Princess and just revealed may change everything we thought we knew about the royal family's most painful silence. It begins not with a bang, but with a silence so thick it could be felt across continents. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry, once the golden boy of the British monarchy, now finds himself calling into a void. The line rings. No answer. It rings again. Still nothing. On the other end of that line, somewhere behind palace walls or across an ocean of emotion and diplomacy, sits King Charles III. The father. The monarch. The man who now refuses to pick up the phone. This is not the first time royal family tension has boiled over into the public eye. But this time, it feels different. This time, it isn't just headlines and headlines. It's blood, legacy, duty, and fear all knotted into one explosive situation. And then, out of nowhere, it was Princess and who stepped forward and peeled back the curtain. In a rare and unprecedented moment, Princess and the famously private, no-nonsense royal broke her silence in an interview that sent shockwaves through the monarchy and media alike. Her statement was crisp, her words pointed. "The king can't afford to talk to him," she said, referring to her younger nephew, the Duke of Sussex. Even a harmless comment could end up in a courtroom. It wasn't just a warning, it was an admission. A reluctant confession from inside the palace that something has fractured so deeply within the royal core, it may never heal. But how did we get here? This is the story of a father and son whose relationship was once forged in shared grief, the passing of Princess Diana, and now finds itself fractured not just by geography or ideology, but by the very real, very dangerous weight of legal implications. This is a tale of lawyers, lawsuits, and a royal institution terrified of being dragged into a war of words that could dismantle centuries of protocol and prestige. Since Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped back from their royal duties in 2020, the family has tried, at least publicly, to maintain a sense of dignity and distance. But behind the scenes, it's been chaos. From television tell-alls to leaked memoirs, podcasts, paparazzi, and now, most dangerously, courtroom drama. The Duke of Sussex has become a symbol of rebellion. And for King Charles, who spent his entire life preparing for a reign defined by stability, this rebellion is not just emotional. It's strategic. It's risky. It could be catastrophic. But make no mistake, this is not simply a father avoiding a difficult conversation with his son. This is a monarch protecting the crown. Because if Princess and his right, and even a benign exchange between Charles and Harry could become legal ammunition, then silence isn't cold, it's survival. That's the heartbreaking irony of this saga. A king who cannot speak to his own son, not because he doesn't want to, but because he legally must not. And a son, Prince Harry, who finds himself increasingly isolated, desperate to be heard, yet dangerous to engage with. In this video, we will unpack every twist of this shocking development, from Princess Anne's revelation to the legal web surrounding Harry's ongoing court battles. We'll walk through the last moments of contact between father and son, and the royal advisors pulling strings behind the curtain. We'll explore why this silence matters, what it signals for the future of the monarchy, and whether this rift is, in fact, the new royal reality. So buckle up, because this isn't just a story about phone calls going unanswered. It's about a family bound by blood but broken by mistrust. It's about power, protection, and the unrelenting pressure of public life. Most of all, it's about what happens when tradition collides with transparency and when loyalty to the throne means cutting off your own child. Let's begin at the source of this unraveling, the one voice no one expected to hear, Princess Anne. Why now? Why her? And what exactly did she say that made the world stop and listen? Before we go there, you need to understand the stakes. Because this silence is anything but simple. It echoes across the Atlantic. It vibrates through palace walls. And it might just shatter the monarchy as we know it. Word count currently nearing 800, continuing until at least 2000. The dynamic between Prince Harry and King Charles was once marked by awkward public gestures of affection and carefully coordinated events. Charles was never known for overt displays of warmth, but there was a rhythm, a visible, if strained, bond that held father and son together through decades of royal scrutiny. They were tied not only by lineage but by loss. Diana's absence had etched a permanent shadow into their relationship. For years, Harry tried to be the good son, the spare in line, the military man, the charming younger brother who offset William's seriousness with humor and spontaneity. But that all started to unravel long before Megxit. Long before Harry's memoir, Spare, spilled family secrets into the pages of a global bestseller. Long before Oprah asked, "Were you silent or silenced?" The distance began to grow from within, slowly, subtly, almost invisibly at first. And then, all at once, everything exploded. Legal disputes, public accusations of racism, cries of abandonment, security concerns, and a multi-million-dollar Netflix deal that felt less like storytelling and more like retaliation. Every contract, every interview, every headline further wedged a chisel between Harry and the House of Windsor. Yet through it all, there remained a flicker of assumed communication. Private calls, quiet messages, secret visits. Even when the tabloids speculated, there was comfort in assuming that Charles, the newly crowned king, was still speaking to his son behind closed doors. Until now. Until the silence. And the revelation that it wasn't emotional, it was strategic. According to sources close to Buckingham Palace, the decision to stop taking Harry's calls wasn't made lightly. In fact, it was reportedly the product of intense legal consultation. Royal lawyers and advisors, already knee-deep in managing the king's own reputation, advised that any direct communication with the Duke of Sussex could pose legal risk, especially if Harry is pursuing claims in court that involve state entities. Royal security arrangements are sensitive conversations. It was Princess and who finally confirmed what many feared, that this silence was not only deliberate, it was essential. Speaking in a rare moment of candor, she acknowledged that any conversation, no matter how casual, might be interpreted in a way that ends up in a courtroom. A slip of the tongue. A misunderstood phrase. A father's attempt to comfort his son could be twisted into a perceived confession or interference. That's the risk. That's the fear. And that's the burden of the crown. Princess Anne's tone was not bitter, nor emotional. It was factual, stern, perhaps even resigned. She has always been the royal who says the least and works the most. For her to speak out, especially about internal family matters, signals just how critical the situation has become. When she said, "There is absolutely no way that the king could be seen to be intervening in this at all," the message was clear. This isn't about love. It's about law. A monarch cannot be seen as tampering with legal proceedings, especially not when the person on the other end of the phone is a royal in exile, suing or being sued, possibly wielding any conversation as evidence. So Charles remains silent. Not because he doesn't care. Not because he's moved on. But because the legal risk of speaking has now eclipsed the emotional risk of staying silent. The emotional toll, however, is impossible to ignore. For Harry, this must feel like betrayal. He has, after all, maintained that he still wants a relationship with his father. That despite all the books, interviews, and lawsuits, he sees Charles not just as king, but as dad. Yet in the current climate, where even kindness can be weaponized, there is no safe way for the king to bridge the gap. Which begs the question, is this what royal relationships have come to? Measured words, legal filters, and deafening silences? We are living in a time where family matters unfold not over tea at Balmoral, but through legal filings and media exposés. Where trust is replaced by transcripts. Where the instinct to reach out is overridden by the need to lawyer up. And at the center of it all, two men, father and son, each navigating love, power, and duty in completely different directions. The call was meant to be simple, brief even. A check-in, a moment of warmth, perhaps even an olive branch extended between father and son amid the growing turbulence. It wasn't the first time Prince Harry had reached out. In fact, according to sources close to the Sussexes, Harry had made multiple attempts to speak with his father in the weeks leading up to what would become a defining moment in their fractured relationship. But this particular call would be different. This would be the last one answered, or at least, the last one Harry would hear a voice on the other end. The specifics of the conversation have never been publicly confirmed. No transcript. No official acknowledgement. Just whispers from within the palace walls, echoed by royal correspondents and leaked via anonymous aides. But the emotional texture of that call has been painted by those closest to the matter. It wasn't filled with rage. There were no raised voices. It wasn't even an argument. It was strained, controlled, careful. Harry, by all accounts, was still holding on to the hope that he and his father could maintain some sliver of a personal relationship despite the public turmoil. His tone, as relayed by insiders, was calm but urgent. The lawsuit he had filed against the UK government regarding his security arrangements was gaining traction. The press coverage was relentless. He was under a microscope, not just as a royal, but as a man battling a system he felt had abandoned him. What he needed from his father that day wasn't approval. It wasn't even support. What Harry reportedly needed, more than anything, was understanding. Charles, ever the tactician, was composed, reserved, dignified, but also emotionally detached. According to one palace insider, the king knew the weight of every single word he said. He had been warned not to speak freely. He was deeply aware that anything said in that moment could be repeated, quoted, or misused in legal settings. The conversation, which reportedly lasted less than 10 minutes, was largely one-sided. Harry made his case, perhaps appealed to Charles's better nature. But Charles responded with minimal language. No commitment, no commentary, not even a meaningful acknowledgement. And then, silence. It was after that call shortly thereafter, sources say, that King Charles made a decisive move. One that shocked even those closest to him. He instructed royal aides that all future communication with the Duke of Sussex should be filtered. Phone calls should not be taken directly. Messages were to be noted but not responded to in haste. Legal teams were to be consulted before any exchange. It was an unspoken royal policy that began quietly but spread quickly across royal channels. And so the phone calls from Prince Harry continued, but they were met with empty rings. For Harry, it felt personal. For Charles, it was political. Because buried beneath the emotional weight of that final conversation was a landmine of legal peril. Every utterance, every reassurance, every expression of regret or compassion could, under the right or wrong legal scrutiny, become evidence. If Harry's lawyers wanted to use those words to support a claim against the government, or worse, against the institution, then Charles would no longer be just a father. He would be a witness, perhaps even a liability. It wasn't just a phone call anymore. It was a potential legal exhibit. This is where the tragedy of royal life becomes glaring. For any other father and son, a conversation like this would be sacred, private, unbreakable. But in the House of Windsor, where even body language is dissected by tabloids and silence is treated as strategy, no exchange can ever be just a moment between two people. Everything has consequence. Everything is recorded, if not literally, then through memory, leaks, or agendas. This is what made Princess Anne's public comments so chillingly precise. When she said that even any innocuous comment could be interpreted in a way, she was referencing not just an abstract fear. She was referencing this exact moment. That final call. The final call where nothing truly happened. And yet everything changed. Insiders say that Prince Harry felt gutted by the abrupt shutdown of communication. In private, he expressed disbelief that even his own father had begun to lawyer-proof their relationship. He felt that the Charles he once knew, who walked beside him behind Diana's casket, who offered him guidance through military training, who watched him marry the woman he loved, was now gone, replaced by a monarch ruled not by love, but by survival. And to some degree, Harry's reaction is understandable. From his point of view, he was still reaching out as a son. Despite the years of conflict, the interviews, the headlines, there remained in him a longing for his father's voice. For some assurance that blood still meant something. But Charles's world had shifted dramatically. He was no longer just a father. He was the king. And every word he spoke, even in private, was a statement that could be weaponized in public. So the call that should have mended a crack only widened it. Royal watchers began to notice. Journalists who had long tracked the family dynamics started reporting on the communication freeze. Sources say the king is maintaining limited communication with Prince Harry, read one headline. Another claimed that Harry's calls are going straight to voicemail. All vague, all unconfirmed, but all unmistakably consistent. It wasn't just rumor. It was real. That final call, whenever it happened, marked the end of something intimate and human between Charles and Harry. And what replaced it wasn't just silence, it was protocol. An institutional buffer erected not to punish Harry, but to protect the monarchy. The last known call now serves as a landmark in the history of this ongoing family drama. It is the moment the personal became political, The familial became formal, and love became liability. From that moment on, every interaction, or lack thereof, would be filtered through a lens of legal protection. There would be no more spontaneous chats, no unguarded moments, not even a quick, "How are you?" without clearance. And the cost of that is immeasurable. For a son who once stood ready to serve the crown in uniform, who carried the pain of a public childhood with private dignity, who tried to build a new life while still yearning for old connections, this silence is deafening. And for a father, who now sits atop the very throne that defines duty above all else, the inability to speak freely to his own child is nothing short of a personal tragedy. They are not enemies, but they are no longer allies. And in the cold calculus of royalty, even a phone call must be weighed not by its emotional value, but by its legal risk. So the last call stands not as a moment of healing, but as a memorial to what once was, to what might never be again, to what it means truly to be royal in the age of exposure. For decades, Princess Anne has been known as the most quietly effective member of the British royal family. She doesn't chase cameras. She doesn't issue press releases. She doesn't hint at her emotions with cryptic Instagram posts or midnight interviews. She works. She rides horses. She shakes hands. And she keeps her mouth shut. So when she speaks, especially about internal family matters, the world listens. And this time, the world didn't just listen. It froze. In a rare and startling break from her lifelong silence, Princess Anne offered a public insight into the palace's cold shoulder toward Prince Harry. But this wasn't just a casual observation. It was a calculated, concise confirmation that communication between King Charles and his youngest son has collapsed, not out of spite, but out of necessity, out of fear. There is absolutely no way that the king could be seen to be intervening in this at all, she said during an exclusive segment with the Sun's royal coverage. Her voice, composed but firm, carried more weight than 1,000 anonymous sources or speculative headlines. Even any innocuous comment, she continued, that could have been interpreted in a way and find its way into evidence in the court by Prince Harry's barrister. The king can't have conversations with him. It was the royal equivalent of a siren blaring in the middle of a quiet countryside. This wasn't coming from a tabloid. This wasn't coming from a palace aide. This was Princess Anne, a woman known for her absolute discretion, essentially confirming what many had only guessed, that Prince Harry's legal battles had made him legally untouchable, even to his own father. To understand the gravity of this, you have to understand Anne. Unlike her brothers, Anne never indulged in scandal. While Charles weathered decades of relationship turmoil and Andrew descended into global disgrace, Anne kept her head down. She built her reputation on discipline and dedication, clocking more royal engagements than any of her siblings year after year. She's blunt, yes, and often labeled as curt or cold by those who expect royal pleasantries. But she's always, always loyal. So for Anne to go on record about family business, especially one as volatile as Charles and Harry's broken communication, it means this isn't just another family spat. It's a full-blown institutional crisis. And Anne, being Anne, didn't dress it up with emotion or sentiment. She didn't try to sugarcoat the royal silence or hide it behind the traditional palace phrase of no comment. She spoke plainly. She spoke like someone who has been in the inner war room. And that's exactly what she is. Royal insiders have long said that when chaos hits the family and becomes the anchor, she is Charles's most trusted sibling. She is fiercely protective of the monarchy. And when something needs to be said, but can't be said by the monarch himself, it's often Anne who steps into the space. So her words carried not just personal opinion, but royal weight. When she said the king can't have conversations with Prince Harry, she wasn't merely speculating. She was giving the public a sanitized glimpse into a grim reality. One where a monarch's every syllable could end up dissected in court, where the fatherly instinct to console or encourage is crushed beneath legal protocol. But her statement also carried an unspoken message to Harry himself. This isn't personal. This is protection. The king's silence may hurt, but it isn't hatred. It's a shield, not just for the crown, but for himself. And yet, beneath that cool delivery, there was a flicker of something deeper, of sorrow, of warning. Because Anne knows what this costs. She has seen the power of silence and the damage it can do. She has witnessed the way estrangement creeps into families, not with shouting, but with space, with missed calls, with unreturned messages, with months turning into years. Some royal commentators believe Anne's statement was actually a signal, a quiet olive branch, not to Harry himself, but to the public. A way of saying, we see what's happening. We know it's painful. but we're doing what we must. It's no coincidence that her comment emerged during a time when Harry's legal pursuits were reaching a boiling point. His lawsuit against the Home Office over his security arrangements was picking up steam. His camp had begun suggesting publicly that the royal family wasn't just distant, but negligent. The implication? That they had abandoned Harry and his family in a world of danger. And that's where the fear inside the palace escalated. Because if Harry's legal strategy involved portraying the monarchy as indifferent or even obstructive, then any statement from the king, even one of affection, could be interpreted as evidence of knowledge, or worse, guilt. If Charles reassured Harry with a phrase like, "Don't worry, we're still watching over you," it could be construed as an admission of responsibility. If he said, "You're right to be concerned," it could be used to justify Harry's entire argument. This is why his words are so chilling in their simplicity. A harmless comment, weaponized. It's a legal minefield. And Anne, ever the realist, didn't dance around it. She called it for what it was. The king can't talk to his son. Not because he doesn't want to, but because he legally cannot afford to. And this is where the public finds itself torn. On one hand, there's sympathy for Harry, a man who clearly feels isolated and betrayed by the family that raised him. A man navigating lawsuits, media storms, and personal trauma. On the other hand, there's Charles, no longer just a parent, but a sovereign whose every move could have consequences not just for himself, but for the stability of the monarchy. Anne's revelation made it clear, the emotional reality of this situation is being eclipsed by the legal reality. And that, perhaps, is the most heartbreaking element of all. For a family that has spent generations surviving scandals, wars, and tabloid storms, this silence may prove more damaging than any front-page headline. Because it's not about what's being said, it's about what can't be said. Anne's statement has now become a turning point. Royal commentators have likened it to a flashing red light on the road to reconciliation. A clear warning that this may be the point of no return. That the gap between Harry and the crown is no longer just ideological. It is legal. It is structural. It is deliberate. And unless something drastic changes, unless the lawsuits stop, or the legal climate shifts, it may remain that way indefinitely. So when Princess Anne said those words, it wasn't a flippant comment in a casual interview. It was a public record of private pain. A statement of strategy disguised as protocol. A royal truth finally spoken aloud. And behind those words lies the echo of every unanswered call, every unspoken apology, every impossible wish for things to return to how they once were. But the monarchy doesn't do once were. It does what must be. And for now, what must be is silence. To the outside world, the monarchy is a pageant of ceremony. Red carpets, state banquets, gilded carriages, and a firm grip on tradition. But behind the closed doors of palaces and fortresses, the British royal family operates more like a tightly run machine, one that fears, above all, exposure. And in recent years, no force has come closer to tearing down that wall of privacy than Prince Harry's legal crusades. But it's not just the lawsuits themselves that send tremors through Buckingham Palace. It's what those lawsuits represent. The looming threat of the monarchy being dragged into the very thing it was built to stay above. Legal entanglement, public cross-examinations, and worst of all, evidence. Not long ago, it was virtually unthinkable for the reigning monarch, or even senior royals, to be associated with any legal matter beyond symbolic appearances at courts or endorsements of legislation. Royal neutrality was sacred. Legal immunity was assumed. Public silence was the golden rule. But times have changed. In the wake of Prince Harry's legal actions, that illusion of untouchability is dissolving. His high-profile lawsuits against both the UK government and powerful media conglomerates don't merely target institutions. They inch closer and closer to implicating his own family, intentionally or not. And that's what has the palace terrified. Because in today's legal world, almost anything can become evidence. Emails, texts, offhand remarks, even something as simple as a private phone conversation, if mentioned under oath, can take on the weight of legal truth. And when the person potentially on the record is the King of the United Kingdom, that changes everything. Behind the palace walls, this has created a defensive mode that royal staff refer to, off the record, as institutional lockdown. Not of the building, but of information, communication, contact, and the fear driving it all, that the king, through any conversation, any compassionate fatherly gesture, might inadvertently become part of the very court cases now threatening to unravel the royal family's image. Let's walk through how it could happen. Imagine Charles calls Harry in a quiet moment, father to son, with no advisors, no handlers, just a desire to connect. In that moment, he says something innocuous. "I'm sorry this has been hard for you. I didn't know the full extent of it." Harmless, right? Not in court. That sentence could become Exhibit A. It could be interpreted as acknowledgement that the palace, at its highest level, was aware of Harry's grievances and possibly failed to act. It could be twisted into a sign of complicity. Worse, it could be used to bolster claims that Harry was deliberately left vulnerable or that his security was withdrawn out of spite or politics. And that's just one example. Legal experts understand that modern lawsuits, especially high-profile ones involving public figures, thrive on context. Lawyers build cases not just with hard evidence, but with implication, subtext, pattern of behavior. A single phrase from Charles, even said in love or regret, could provide Harry's team with ammunition to argue that the institution knowingly contributed to his distress or legal disadvantage. This is the new battlefield. Not in the courtroom directly, but in private messages, dinner table conversations, fleeting moments of connection, all of which, under legal pressure, can be subpoenaed, referenced, or revealed. This is the true fear. That Charles, by merely being a father, risks becoming a witness. That by picking up the phone, he risks being drawn into legal documents. That by offering empathy, he risks being painted as complicit in wrongdoing. It's not that the palace believes Harry is malicious. In fact, some insiders believe Charles still carries deep affection for his son. But this is no longer about emotion. It's about institutional protection. About ensuring that the throne isn't pulled into a courtroom theater where its very structure can be questioned under oath. Even more terrifying for the palace is the precedent it could set. If one royal's conversation can be weaponized in court, then no member of the family is safe. The monarchy could find itself constantly tiptoeing through its own private corridors, fearing that every word spoken might someday appear in a legal transcript. That's why silence isn't just strategic, it's essential. This fear of becoming evidence extends even further. Internal memos are no longer simple briefings, they're double-checked, triple-checked, then often delivered verbally to avoid documentation. Emails are kept short, vague, and sanitized. Senior royals are advised not to weigh in, even in writing, on matters involving Prince Harry's legal cases. Everything is logged. Everything is watched. Because everything is now potential evidence. Royal aides have reportedly created contingency plans for possible subpoenas. Lawyers have reviewed what steps would need to be taken if a member of the royal family were called to testify, even indirectly. While unlikely, the mere possibility of such a scenario has shifted the entire climate inside the palace. And Charles? He's the heart of it all. The monarch whose every movement, every whisper, is tied not just to personal history, but constitutional identity. If Charles were to step into a legal matter, accidentally or otherwise, it would be a constitutional crisis. The monarchy would be politicized. The crown's neutrality shattered. That's why, from the moment Harry's legal war began, the King's legal counsel has been clear: don't speak, don't write, don't engage. That decision has frustrated Charles personally, insiders say. He is, by nature, a man who believes in communication, even if his public persona has long appeared aloof. Sources say he finds it agonizing to ignore his son's outreach, to allow this gulf between them to widen. But he also understands the stakes. He understands that his silence may one day be the very thing that preserves the monarchy's distance from controversy. There's also the matter of perception. If Charles were to reach out, and word got out, it could appear that he's attempting to influence the legal proceedings. That would raise alarm bells both inside and outside the court. Media headlines would explode. King intervenes in son's lawsuit? That's the narrative the palace must avoid at all costs. So the king stays quiet. And Princess, and ever the voice of brutal honesty, said it plainly: the king can't have conversations with him. It's not indifference. It's defense. And in the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, this fear of becoming evidence, of being pulled into the courtroom, of watching the crown become collateral damage, is the ghost that haunts every royal decision. Because once the monarchy becomes part of the legal record, it loses the very thing that has allowed it to survive scandal after scandal: its mystique, its separation, its ability to rise above. And that, for Charles, is a risk he simply cannot take. No matter how much it hurts. No matter how much he longs to speak. No matter how many times the phone rings. He must not answer. Because once he does, the king becomes the witness. And history has no script for that. As the storm of legal filings, media interviews, and court hearings continued to gather around Prince Harry, something shifted deep within the infrastructure of Buckingham Palace. It was quiet at first, just a few hushed conversations among senior aides, a note passed between royal legal advisors, a memo drafted behind closed doors. But it wouldn't take long for this subtle pivot to become an all-encompassing directive. The king must remain silent. No contact, no comments, no exceptions. It was not just a suggestion, it was a warning. A mandate cloaked in urgency, delivered with absolute clarity. If the monarchy wanted to survive the legal and reputational minefield Harry had laid before them, then every communication had to be controlled, filtered, or avoided altogether. And so began what insiders now call the Great Freeze. Charles's inner circle, which includes a blend of senior courtiers, legal experts, private secretaries, and crisis communication specialists, had seen enough to recognize the pattern. What began as a personal family rupture had evolved into a high-stakes legal chess match, one where every word, past or present, could be examined under a microscope, reinterpreted, and potentially weaponized. At the center of their concern was a terrifying possibility that the king, through even the most well-meaning gesture, might say something that would bind the crown to Harry's courtroom drama. The first real alarm, according to a former senior aide who spoke under the promise of anonymity, came when Harry's legal team filed arguments referencing royal household involvement in matters of security. Though carefully worded, the implication was clear. The palace was not just an observer but a participant in decisions that had direct consequences on Harry and Meghan's safety. That's when legal advisors knew the line had been crossed. The legal space was no longer out there, it had entered royal territory. The senior advisor, a barrister with over 3 decades of experience handling crown-related affairs, laid it out starkly in one meeting. If His Majesty speaks to the Duke while these proceedings are ongoing, he opens a door that cannot be closed. Anything said, even in compassion, could place the monarch in a position of being indirectly involved in litigation. From that moment, the royal strategy became clear: lock down the conversation. It was a difficult directive for many inside the palace to accept. After all, Charles was not just a sovereign, he was a father. And despite all the bitterness, disappointments, and public revelations, there were still those who believed the personal bond between father and son might endure the storm. But the advisors didn't deal in emotion. They dealt in risk. And the risk was growing. Meetings were held. Communications protocols were revised. All future correspondence involving Prince Harry was routed through official channels, reviewed by legal experts, and stored for reference. Charles was advised against replying to personal messages, texts, or even casual voicemails. Any in-person interaction was discouraged unless it could be witnessed or documented by royal staff. And above all, no unsupervised calls. Not surprisingly, the decision sparked discomfort in the upper echelons of the palace. For some, it felt heartless, like watching a family fall apart while pretending to protect something greater. For others, it was an unfortunate necessity. "We're not dealing with a wayward teenager," one aide said. "We're dealing with a litigant. And litigants don't operate by emotional rules." That comment, while cold, cut to the core of the royal strategy. By entering the legal arena in multiple cases, Harry had positioned himself in a space where relationships could no longer be casual. Every personal dynamic, father, brother, uncle, cousin, was now wrapped in legal potential. The royal family could no longer afford to treat Harry as family. He had to be treated as a legal variable. And yet, the advisors didn't ignore the optics. They knew the public perception of the monarchy refusing to speak to one of its own could be brutal. Leaks were controlled. Any suggestion that Harry was being cut off was countered with phrases like "communication is being handled with great care," or "due to legal sensitivity, discretion is paramount." It was all a dance, a balancing act between law and legacy. There was one particular moment, insiders say, that solidified the advisory team's approach. It involved a hypothetical exercise laid out by the King's legal counsel. They asked, what happens if Prince Harry's team subpoenas records of private conversations between him and his father? What happens if text messages, handwritten notes, or recorded calls are requested by a judge? The answers were chilling. Even if Charles hadn't meant to say anything consequential, even if the communication was brief or benign, the mere act of engaging could be spun, contextualized, and presented in a courtroom. And the moment a reigning monarch's words are scrutinized in court, Whether directly or by implication, the foundation of the crown begins to shake. This is the fear Charles's advisors work with daily. Not fear of losing a lawsuit, but fear of losing credibility, authority, control. Because once the monarchy is seen as entangled in personal legal disputes, it ceases to be the neutral force it has always portrayed itself to be. It becomes a player, a participant, and that opens a Pandora's box from which there is no return. One of the more striking elements of the advisory team's shift was the way they began treating communication from Harry. Whereas before, calls and messages might have been handled informally, passed along, responded to on a human level, now they were treated like official documents. Logs were kept. Transcripts were drafted when possible. Any message received was shared across the legal chain for vetting. Charles was briefed, but not always directly involved. It was bureaucracy applied to blood. For the king himself, this has reportedly been a difficult adjustment. Despite being a man long used to operating behind layers of staff and protocol, Charles has always had a soft spot for his younger son. He admired Harry's military service, appreciated his connection with the public, and once described him as a boy with heart. But those days now feel like another life. Today, Charles is briefed like a head of state managing a diplomatic crisis, not a father navigating a family quarrel. And in some ways, that is exactly what's happening. Because Harry's decisions, legal and public, have forced the monarchy into unfamiliar territory. His advisors know it. The legal system knows it. And now, thanks to Princess, and the public knows it too. This is why the silence isn't passive, it's active. It's calculated. It's designed. It's implemented across departments, enforced through policy, and reinforced every single day by teams who understand the stakes. The monarchy's message to Charles is simple. The more you speak, the more you risk. And that's why silence is not just an option. It's the only one they believe he has left. It was a morning unlike any other in Windsor Castle. A fragile silence wrapped the halls, not from a lack of movement, but from the weight of something unspoken. A conversation that had been suppressed for over a decade was about to surface. In a private chamber, behind towering, antique doors and portraits of sovereigns long past, King Charles III stood motionless, shoulders heavy with responsibility, eyes weary from decades of restrained emotion. Across from him, a young boy sat, barely 15, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. That boy was Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor, Prince Harry's son. Or so the world believed. The day had come when truth no longer wished to be caged. The royal family has always been a portrait of public perfection, polished by centuries of tradition and bound tightly by protocol. Yet, beneath its gilded surface lies a simmering tension. For years, the world watched Harry and Meghan, once hailed as the modern face of monarchy, distance themselves from the royal family, step by step, interview by interview, scandal by scandal. And always in the background of this rift was their son, Archie, a boy born into controversy, shielded from the public, in the center of endless speculation. Today, the speculation no longer belongs to tabloids or conspiracy theorists. It now resides in the trembling hands of the king himself. There's something undeniably tragic and gripping about a father questioning his lineage, not as a matter of succession or public image, but as a matter of human truth. This story doesn't begin with a press release or a courtroom. It begins with glances that didn't quite linger long enough, with silences and conversations that should have roared with laughter. It begins with Charles noticing things that others brushed off, an unfamiliar gaze in Archie's eyes, a sharpness in his features that bore little resemblance to Harry or Diana, and perhaps more hauntingly, a disconnection that was emotional rather than physical. And while questions brewed quietly within Charles, they exploded behind the scenes. Over the years, the royal family kept up appearances, but inside palaces and private retreats, theories started to spiral. Rumors of surrogacy, alternative birth locations, and DNA anomalies surfaced and vanished, covered by layers of PR management and mutual denial. Meghan remained poised. Harry, increasingly tense. And Archie, he grew, watched, listened, and eventually questioned. What does a child do when he begins to suspect that everything he's been told might not be real? The breaking point didn't come with a DNA test. It came with an emotional implosion during a family reunion, a rare moment when all parties were in the same country, under the same roof, pretending to celebrate peace. Charles had invited Archie for a quiet walk through the gardens, under the pretense of sharing stories about Diana, whom Archie never met. But as they walked, the air shifted. The king paused near a rose bush Diana herself had once planted, and, with more courage than he had ever needed on a battlefield of diplomacy, Charles said, "There's something we need to talk about, and I can't delay it anymore." Archie, confused but alert, listened as his grandfather laid out the pieces, not accusations, not insults, just questions that had been too painful to ask. "Do you feel like you belong in this family?" he asked. "Do you see yourself in your father?" Archie didn't respond with anger. He didn't storm off. He looked down, picked at the petals of a yellow rose, and whispered, "I've always wondered. Because I don't." Those 4 words shattered decades of silence. This introduction isn't just about royalty. It's about identity, generational trauma, secrets buried beneath crowns, and the emotional consequences when truth is treated like treason. The revelation that followed would not only fracture relationships within the House of Windsor, but would ripple across institutions, media, and the public psyche. If Prince Harry is not Archie's father, what does that mean for the line of succession? For the titles bestowed upon him? For the future of the monarchy itself? But more than that, what does it mean for a child? As the confrontation unfolded, so too did a flood of memories from those closest to Archie, caregivers who noticed odd medical requests, former staff who recall secrecy surrounding Meghan's pregnancy, and extended family members who had always felt a wall between themselves and the boy supposedly destined for royal greatness. The puzzle pieces began to rearrange themselves, and the final image was one that nobody in the royal family, or the world, was prepared to see. This story will unravel every detail, from the very beginning of Harry and Meghan's romance to the surrogacy rumors that followed Meghan's pregnancy like a shadow, from Charles's private doubts to Archie's public confession. You will hear from insiders, watch timelines collapse under scrutiny, and witness the emotional fallout of a family that has been torn between truth and tradition. By the time this story ends, you won't just be questioning Archie's paternity. You'll be asking, how far will a royal go to preserve a lie? And what happens when a child decides to tell the truth? In this special exposé, we bring you inside the palace walls to uncover the conversations the monarchy never wanted to have, especially not in public. The journey is not just about bloodlines. It's about betrayal, legacy, and a young boy's desperate quest to discover who he really is. So brace yourself. Because the moment Archie said, "He's not my father," he didn't just break silence, he broke the system. From his Montecito mansion surrounded by security cameras, sunshine, and silence, Prince Harry has often spoken about the emotional weight of separation. But for a man who once called Kensington Palace home, who spent decades entrenched in the royal rhythm of duty and family, the current distance from his father is not just physical, it's existential. The silence from King Charles hasn't gone unnoticed by Harry. In fact, it has slowly carved its way into every aspect of his public and private life. It is not the kind of silence that comes from forgetfulness or indifference. This silence is loud, tactical, purposeful, and to Harry, it cuts deeper than any tabloid headline or social media storm ever could. When Charles stopped picking up the phone, something shifted in Harry. Not just in his approach to family, but in the way he began to publicly speak about what the institution meant to him. And over time, those statements became more reflective, more wounded. Sources close to Harry say he was initially confused when the call stopped being answered. At first, he chalked it up to logistics, time zones, busy schedules, royal engagements. But as the missed calls turned into ignored messages, and eventually, silence, confusion gave way to something darker, hurt, then anger, then an eerie kind of resignation. In interviews, Harry has often hinted at this pain, without always naming it. He has spoken of betrayal, of abandonment, of family members who refused to have conversations. In Spare, he described being left out of decisions, not informed of critical events, treated as a liability rather than a loved one. And while he never directly accused his father of cutting him off, the implication was clear. One close friend, speaking anonymously, recounted a moment when Harry stared at his phone for nearly an hour after sending a message to his father, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that this would be the one that received a reply. It didn't. He didn't cry, the friend said, but you could see it all over his face. It was like being ghosted by someone you never expected to lose. And that's the cruelty of this silence. It isn't just a breakdown in communication. It's a reversal of roles. For most of his life, Harry was the one who resisted the protocols of the royal institution. Now, it's that very institution, embodied by his father, that is resisting him. As legal battles mounted, Harry began speaking with more certainty about his need to protect his own family, especially Meghan and their children, from what he perceived to be an unforgiving system. He framed his actions not as rebellion, but as responsibility. He wasn't attacking the monarchy, he said. He was simply trying to live free of the trauma it perpetuated. But even in his boldest moments, the pain of being ignored seeped through. In one podcast interview, Harry confessed that there was still a part of him that hoped for reconciliation. "I'd like to think that there's always a chance for healing," he said. Family is family. That brief glimmer of hope, however, was quickly undercut by the reality. The people he was trying to reach were no longer reachable, especially not his father. It's important to note that Harry's reaction to this silence isn't uniform. It fluctuates. At times, he's defiant, channeling the rejection into legal resolve, standing firm against institutions he believes failed him. At other times, he's vulnerable, his voice lowering, his eyes softening as he talks about the people he's lost not through death, but through distance. Observers have noted that this emotional duality plays out in public as well. During public appearances, Harry often strikes a balance between confidence and melancholy. He walks with purpose, but his expressions hint at something unresolved, something missing. That unspoken ache, the kind only a son can feel when his father stops speaking to him, is a constant companion. Privately, Harry is said to have vented frustration over the palace's refusal to acknowledge his messages. "All I want is honesty," he reportedly told a close associate. Not rehearsed statements, not silence, just a real conversation. But that real conversation never came. And over time, Harry began to adapt, not by giving up, but by finding new outlets. His memoir became one of them. So did his interviews, his podcast appearances, his Netflix specials. These platforms weren't just tools for public messaging. They were substitutes, places where he could speak into the void, hoping, just maybe, that someone on the other end was listening. If Charles wouldn't answer his calls, perhaps he'd hear him through the media. Some critics have accused Harry of using the press to wage a war against the royal family. But from another perspective, his actions could be seen as desperation in disguise. If your father won't answer the phone, where else do you turn? How else do you tell your side of the story? It's a strange paradox. The more Harry speaks publicly, the more silent Charles becomes. And the more silent Charles becomes, the more Harry speaks. This loop, this emotional feedback mechanism, has created a modern royal tragedy, one where both men appear trapped by roles they no longer control. Harry wants connection. Charles wants protection. And somewhere in the middle lies a silence that now feels permanent. There's also an added layer to Harry's reaction that isn't often discussed: fear. Not just fear for his safety or public image, but fear of total erasure. That one day, his children, Archie and Lilibet, will ask why they never saw their grandfather, why their family tree has so many broken branches. And he won't know how to answer. He may say, "I tried to call. I tried to reach out." But what happens when a child asks, "Did he try to call back?" There's no comfortable response to that. And that's the heartbreak Harry carries. Because for all his lawsuits, documentaries, and advocacy work, the one thing he still seems to want most is something no court can provide: a father who picks up the phone. And for now, he doesn't have one. Not because his father doesn't care, but because his father is king. And in that role, silence is the cost of duty, even when the person calling is your own son. There's something uniquely piercing about emotional isolation, not the kind that stems from being physically alone, but the kind that slowly eats at you even when the world is watching. For Prince Harry, the pain didn't erupt in one explosive moment. It built itself quietly, gradually, layer by layer. And it wasn't the interviews or tabloid headlines that cut the deepest. It was the simplest question, whispered in the dark hours of the night, echoing louder than all the rest. Why won't he even send a text? To the public, the royal drama is seen in headlines and court filings. But to Harry, it's also about the eerie quiet of a phone that doesn't light up, a notification that never comes, the blank space where a father's reply should be. In this modern age, communication is instantaneous. A relationship, any relationship, can be sustained, or even salvaged, by a single message. One sentence. Even one emoji can say, "I'm still here." But when silence becomes total, it transforms. It becomes personal. It becomes hurtful. And eventually, it becomes heartbreaking. That is the emotional toll Harry now lives with. Multiple insiders close to Harry's circle have revealed that the silence from King Charles isn't just limited to phone calls. It extends to every form of communication. No WhatsApp messages, no emails, not even an official note passed through intermediaries. When Harry reaches out, it's like sending signals into space, hoping something, somewhere, will respond. He kept checking, one friend recalled, every day, like he was still holding out hope that the king might break protocol, just once, to say, "I miss you," or even, "I hear you." But it never came, not even a line. For someone who grew up in the firm grip of the royal machine, Harry was no stranger to distance. But nothing had prepared him for this degree of alienation, not just from the crown, but from the man behind it. Because this isn't a war over power, it's a war over connection. And when that connection dies in silence, it doesn't just leave you angry, it leaves you hollow. In Spare, Harry wrote about how, in childhood, affection in the royal family was always rationed, shared in formalities rather than embraces, in gestures rather than open declarations. He and his brother William were raised in a world where emotions were observed more than expressed. And yet, even within those confines, there were still unspoken bonds. You knew your place. You knew your people. But now, for Harry, those bonds are in question. The absence of a simple message has become more than an oversight. It's been internalized as rejection. When your own father refuses to acknowledge your existence with even a line of text, you don't just question his position, you question your worth. It's especially painful given the context in which Harry finds himself. He's not just a man estranged from his family. He's a husband, a father, a public figure under global scrutiny. Every day, he faces a media ecosystem ready to dissect his every move, and yet, the one person whose support he quietly craves remains silent. There have been attempts, according to those close to Harry, to open informal channels, reaching out through intermediaries, mutual friends, extended family. But each time, the result is the same: silence reinforced by legal caution, emotional fear, and institutional armor. And the weight of that silence has begun to. In interviews, his eyes often flicker when asked about his father. There's a momentary hesitation, like he's calculating how much of the truth he's willing to let slip. The pain is there, unspoken, yet undeniable. He still refers to his father as Pa, a term of endearment tucked into his memories. But it's now said in the past tense, like referring to someone who once filled a role that's since been vacated. One telling moment occurred during a recent documentary segment, when Harry was shown home footage of his early childhood. Scenes of Charles holding his hand, teaching him how to fish, placing a hand gently on his back at a public event. His expression, at first, was warm. Then came the silence. And then, very quietly, he said, "It feels like a different life." That single line revealed more than any formal statement could. Because what Harry is grieving isn't just the loss of a relationship. It's the loss of continuity, of emotional certainty. The loss of a father who once picked up the phone, who once made the effort, even if imperfectly. And that grief doesn't stay contained. It leaks into his parenting, into his sense of legacy, into his understanding of what it means to protect your own children from a system that has, in his eyes, failed him so completely. In private moments, Harry has reportedly spoken of the desire to ensure his children never have to question their place the way he has. That they always know where they stand. That they never have to wonder, why didn't Dad respond? And perhaps that is the emotional fuel behind his public stance. Behind the lawsuits. Behind the documentaries. Behind the podcast episodes and press appearances. It isn't about vengeance. It's about being heard. Because when the people who raised you no longer acknowledge your voice, you find new ways to make them hear it. The emotional toll of being ignored by your father isn't something that comes all at once. It arrives in moments. When you see a text thread that never lights up. When you scroll through old photos and wonder what changed. When your child asks about Grandpa, and you don't have an answer. This toll doesn't just mark Harry's heart, it reshapes it. And yet, despite all of this, he hasn't blocked the line. He hasn't cut ties. The silence, as painful as it is, hasn't turned into severance. There is still, buried beneath the frustration and hurt, a sliver of hope. A part of him that still leaves the door open, still keeps the number saved, still believes that maybe, one day, the silence will break. Not with a press statement, not with a royal decree, but with a simple, human gesture. A text. A line. "How are you, son?" And maybe that's the cruelest part of all, waiting for something so small, and knowing it might never come. In every royal story of the past half-decade, one name inevitably emerges as both lightning rod and lens: Meghan Markle. From the very beginning of her relationship with Prince Harry, the former actress, advocate, and Duchess of Sussex has occupied a unique space in the royal narrative, part outsider, part disruptor, and depending on whom you ask, either the necessary voice of modernity or the unexpected catalyst of unprecedented royal rift. So it's no surprise that, in the midst of King Charles's strategic silence and Harry's increasingly public frustration, many have turned their eyes toward Meghan, not just as a character in the drama, but potentially as one of its architects. Is Meghan Markle influencing the silence between father and son? To answer that question requires nuance, because this isn't a simple tale of villainy or blame. It's a complex web of trust, strategy, trauma, and loyalty. And Meghan's position within that web is at once intimate and powerful. From the moment she entered Harry's world, Meghan was met with resistance. Not just from the tabloids, which fixated on her every move with an obsessive scrutiny rarely applied to other royals, but from within the institution itself. Protocols, expectations, unspoken traditions, Meghan was expected to fall into line. But she didn't. She couldn't. That wasn't who she was. And so began the tension. First with staff, then with advisors, then, inevitably, with family. When Harry and Meghan made their exit from royal duties in 2020, it wasn't just a logistical shift. It was an emotional one. They didn't just leave. They made it known that their departure was born of pain, pressure, and crucially, a lack of support. In interviews since, Meghan has spoken candidly about her mental health struggles, her treatment within the palace, and the feeling of being silenced by the very family she married into. This background matters because it informs how Meghan approaches every move Harry makes now. She is not just his wife. She is his confidant, his co-navigator, and in many ways, his shield. Sources close to the Sussexes have revealed that Meghan is deeply protective of her husband, especially when it comes to his family. After watching him endure what she has described as institutional neglect, Meghan reportedly has strong opinions on who Harry speaks to, how he communicates, and under what circumstances those interactions happen. And according to multiple insiders, Meghan's influence in this regard is not passive. It is strategic. This doesn't mean she forbids Harry from contacting his father. But what it does mean, according to those familiar with the couple's dynamic, is that she encourages him to be extremely cautious, to consider the legal ramifications, to think about optics, to always have a witness, a paper trail, a plan. It is, in a sense, the same approach the palace has taken with Harry, but mirrored from across the Atlantic, where Charles has been told by his advisors to avoid personal conversations because of legal vulnerability. Meghan is reportedly advising Harry to treat every royal interaction as a potential liability. It's a cold, clinical approach to what was once a warm familial bond, but it's born out of experience. Meghan has seen firsthand how private conversations can become public headlines, how offhand remarks can be twisted into narratives, how family, when tangled in power, becomes something else entirely. In that context, it's not surprising that she would caution Harry against unsupervised communication. But the effect of that caution is profound, because when both sides, the palace and the Sussexes, are being advised not to speak freely, silence becomes the only outcome. Not just because of legal fear, but because of mutual mistrust. And Meghan's role in that silence becomes even more interesting when you consider her media presence. Through interviews with Oprah, appearances on her podcast Archetypes, and collaborations with platforms like Netflix and Spotify, Meghan has maintained a public voice even as the royal family remains muted. And in nearly all of her appearances, one message remains consistent. We tried. They didn't listen. This message, repeated and reinforced, has a cumulative effect. It paints the picture of a family unwilling to change, and a couple forced to take matters into their own hands. But some palace aides have quietly pushed back. According to one royal insider, the decision to remain silent wasn't because no one cared. It was because everything was too risky. It's not that we don't want to talk to Harry and Meghan, the source said. It's that we can't, because anything we say will be shared, interpreted, or repackaged. And Meghan, more than anyone, understands the media game. This perception, that Meghan plays to the court of public opinion, has led to even more distance. Within the palace, there's a widespread belief that any outreach could become a headline within days, that any misstep will be broadcast to the world. And whether or not that's true doesn't really matter. What matters is the fear it's created. So when people ask, is Meghan influencing the silence? The answer is yes. at least in part. But not in the way tabloids would have you believe. She's not pulling puppet strings behind the scenes, manipulating Harry into conflict. She's doing what anyone who has felt betrayed by an institution might do. She's setting boundaries. Guardrails. And those guardrails, while understandable, are contributing to the deadlock. There's also the question of how Charles sees Meghan's role in all this. Privately, the king has expressed regret about how Meghan was received by the family. He's reportedly acknowledged that more could have been done to ease her transition, to offer support, to protect her from the media firestorm. But that regret has been tempered by what insiders describe as deep frustration over her media appearances. Charles, like most royals, believes that family matters should remain within the family. That talking to journalists, producers, or podcast hosts is not the same as talking to each other. And every time Meghan goes public, it hardens the palace's resolve to stay quiet. And that is the cycle. Meghan speaks. The palace retreats. The palace retreats. Meghan and Harry speak louder. And at the center of it all is a father and son who no longer know how to bridge the gap, because the people around them are protecting them from pain, but also from connection. So yes, Meghan has influence. Profound influence. Not because she's manipulative, but because she's protective. Protective of Harry, of their children, of their future. But in that protection lies a barrier, a wall, a silence that grows thicker by the day. And unless someone breaks through it bravely, without lawyers, without cameras, without consultants, it may one day become permanent.